Hi, all. Welcome in, folks. We will give it just a minute or two for everyone to join, be let in from the waiting room, and then at probably 5:33, 5:34 Pacific time, we'll get started. All right, I will go ahead and kick us off here. My name's Stephen Cooper. I'm one of the organizers here at the ACLU of Washington. I'll be moderating the panel tonight. The webinar is Choose Shelter, Not Penalties, Ending the Criminalization of Homelessness in Washington. It is being put on by the ACLU of Washington, as well as a couple of our partner organizations and staff from those organizations, who I will introduce in just a moment here. We are doing this webinar to sort of build awareness and education around the issue and talk about, why now? Why are we having this conversation and the significance of it and how we can move forward? And so I want to take a moment for us to sort of ground ourselves in the conversation being about understanding the impact of homelessness and of criminalizing homelessness, what the law requires of areas, what it does not require of areas and jurisdictions, and what a more humane statewide approach to solving the problem of homelessness in Washington can look like. And so tonight's panel brings together people of lived experience, people from frontline services, legal expertise, and state level policy to help ground this conversation in real world impact and accessible context. And so I will go ahead and introduce all of our lovely panelists now, starting with Dr. Lamont Green, who is a leader with the Lived Experience Coalition and brings both lived experience and professional experience to this conversation. His work centers the voices of people directly impacted by homelessness and criminalization, helping us understand what these policies look like in people's real lives, not just on paper. Uh, we also have Julie Garcia with us, who is the executive director of Jules Helping Hands, a frontline service provider working directly with people experiencing homelessness. Julie brings critical insight into how criminalization and displacement affect people's ability to access services, stabilize, and build trust. We also have Eric Tars, who is the policy director at the National Homelessness Law Center. Eric brings deep legal expertise and a national perspective on homelessness law and will help us understand what the Constitution actually requires and, just as importantly, what it does not require when it comes to criminalizing homelessness. And we also have Jasmine Clark with us, who is the Smart Policy Program Director here at the ACLU of Washington. She leads our organization's work on homelessness policy and will frame why Washington needs a clearer approach on a statewide level to limiting the criminalization of homelessness at this moment. And so, having introduced all of our fantastic panelists, I will kick us off here with the first question to Dr. Green, which is from your lived experience and your work with others directly impacted. What does criminalization actually look like day to day for people who are experiencing homelessness?
Oh, thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. It's great to be here. So when we talk about the criminalization of homelessness, we're not just talking about a theory. We're actually talking about what is happening to real people every single day across our state and across our country. When survival itself is treated like a crime, and I know this because I've actually lived it. And I know it because I also work alongside of others that are living it right now. In King County, there was an initiative called the Familiar Faces Initiative. And through that initiative, we learned what happens when systems stop responding with punishment and start responding with housing and care. Jail bookings dropped by 50%, emergency room visits fell by around 30%, and public costs went down, not because people disappeared or because they were swept away, but because we shifted from a criminal legal response to a housing and human services response. And this tells us something important. The problem was never the people, the problem was the response, right? We learned from the war on drugs and that huge failure. And so we don't need to repeat this. The data shows us that sweeps don't end homelessness. They just shift people around and they lose important documents. Uh, Emergency room visits increase. Fentanyl and drug overdoses increase also because people aren't in their networks and aren't able to get life-saving drugs. And they also break trust. But we know that safe and humane shelter and housing works, coordination works, care works. And that is why we really need this Homeless Bill of Rights, because no one should lose their dignity, their health, or their life simply because they don't have a home. So we need to choose shelter over sweeps, housing over handcuffs, not because it's the right and moral thing to do, but that's a big piece of it, but it just makes good dollar and cents. We know from the data that spending money in the criminal legal system and through criminalization is extremely costly, and it takes people back instead of bringing them forward. And in a place, right, where housing affordability and wealth inequality is at a record high, trying to simply survive should never, never be a crime.
Thank you for that, Dr. Green. And I want to ask a quick follow-up, which is, can you kind of talk about what happens after someone is cited for homelessness or is swept from where they are, and sort of how that can immediately sort of impact someone's life and their situation?
Yeah, so when someone is swept, right, they're just moved somewhere else. And if they're cited, then they have to appear at court. They get a ticket that could lead to a warrant. And it just ends up being this vicious, vicious cycle that makes it difficult to find work, makes it difficult to stabilize, losing important documents, and even people form community in our unhoused community. People form community. So they also lose their safety networks in their community, and they're pushed further and further away from services as well. So there's a host of negative impacts, Stefan, that is just really, really not only inhumane, but doesn't make sense whatsoever.
Thank you for that, Dr. Green. And then for Julie, I want to ask, sort of from a service provider perspective, how do criminal penalties and displacement show up in your work? And how do they affect people's ability to access support, which I know Dr. Green sort of touched on? Oh, you're muted, Julie.
There we go. Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate being in a room with people who care about our neighbors and want to understand what actually helps them move forward. There are three things that happen in the world in which I existed when people get cited or swept. One, criminalization makes survival harder, not easier. Two, displacement disrupts progress and increases crisis. And these practices make it harder for people to access support. I currently run 4 of our scattered site shelters here in Spokane, Washington, which bring in chronically homeless individuals every single day. We, in 2022, closed Camp Hope, and that's where we saw the biggest impact of criminality in people experiencing homelessness. There were 689 people on that one city block that existed there for about 18 months. And during that time, we were able to house only 279 of those folks. And most of them, those reasons were for criminal barriers, which made it absolutely impossible to house the folks that needed housing the most. And that was because people live outside. And when they live outside, you don't have alarm clocks. Your phone, maybe you have one, probably got stolen. When you get a citation, you're expected to show up to court just like we are. How do you know that it's your day when you don't know if it's Monday or Wednesday or Friday for that matter? Because days just begin to bleed into each other. So it ends up getting somebody a warrant. With a warrant, then they're arrested for whatever their crime is. It's increased the penalty. Sometimes that kicks them out of community court, which is what we utilize here, and moves them into regular court where the penalties are a lot stronger than they are in community court. Community court works to bring services and services to people. When they get swept, they're displaced and have to go somewhere else. And we've lost all the progress that we had up until that moment. So, any documents that we would have received, medications that we got people on, outreach providers who know where people are do not know where their client is. Lots of times during the week, I get phone calls from housing providers who are looking for their clients because their name has been pulled. These clients have no way to get a hold of them because all of their possessions have been removed by the police or by enforcement. So those folks lose the opportunity to get housing and move to the bottom of a 3-year wait list again. And so you can see why that would be super discouraging to people experiencing homelessness. After time of doing this, they lose hope. And for people on the street, hope is the one thing you can't live without.
Thank you for that, Julie. And I want to now pivot to more of a sort of legal standpoint and Eric, your input on this, if you wouldn't mind, which is there's a lot of confusion around what cities can and can't do under the law. Can you kind of walk us through what the Constitution actually requires when it comes to criminalizing homelessness?
Sure. Well, so for many years in the Ninth Circuit, where Washington is, the law of the land was that you could have these laws criminalizing basic life-sustaining activities like sleeping or sheltering yourself on the books. But if there wasn't sufficient adequate shelter for people to go to, then you couldn't enforce those laws. And that was under a case called Martin versus Boise. That came down in 2019. But as many folks may be aware, that case was overturned by a case called Johnson versus Grants Pass that was decided by the Supreme Court in June of 2024, about a year and a half ago. And we warned the court at the time that this would be seen as a green light for communities to criminalize homelessness. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen. More than 300 communities have passed these laws, in some cases, even to the point of specifically removing the language from their ordinances that required them to make sure there was adequate alternative space first. And so now they can enforce those anti-camping, anti-sleeping laws, even if there's literally nowhere else where people can go. And somehow the courts have said that's okay. However, they were very careful to say the Constitution provides a floor, it's not a ceiling. So it doesn't require communities to take measures to protect people, but it does not prevent communities or states from protecting homeless individuals if that's what they choose to do. So something, for example, like the bill we're going to discuss later, is definitely 100% constitutional, very consistent with what the Supreme Court said is allowed. Um, it's just a bare start, just to say that you can't enforce these laws. If there is shelter available, doesn't require that shelter exists. It doesn't require that housing exists, and housing is, separate from shelter. And unfortunately, there are other constitutional cases that have said in the past that communities aren't required to provide adequate housing or even basic shelter to people in the community. So uh, that would be the ultimate goal would be to ensure the human right to housing for everybody in our country. Um, Hopefully, we'll move towards that someday. But at the moment, at a minimum, we can say that while these laws criminalizing homelessness are unfortunately allowed under the Eighth Amendment, there may be other protections, and the court was also very careful to say that. Homeless people are not without rights. They still have rights, and there may be a right to sleep and shelter themselves to be found under another amendment. We haven't found that yet, but legal folks are working on it. But they also have due process rights. There may be limits on how much notice somebody needs to be given before they can be evicted from an encampment. There may be limits on, or they may be required to provide storage for their things. They have First Amendment rights to associate with other people, to share food, to ask for donations. Those sorts of things haven't been struck down by the court as yet. So there are other important rights out there, but at least around camping anti-camping laws, they are allowed, but they can also be regulated and restricted if a state or a municipality chooses to do that.
Thank you for that. And Eric, you mentioned the increase in these sort of anti-camping laws after grants pass was passed out of the Supreme Court. Can you kind of talk about what the risks and the hazards are with the more patchwork local approach that a lot of places are taking?
Yeah, and one of the things we said about the um, the Martin versus Boise standard uh, is and having a state standard around these things is communities often resist and say, we don't want these limitations on what we can do. But in fact, laws or standards like the Martin versus Boise standard or laws like the one we're going to discuss later actually help communities because it removes this kind of incentive for a race to the bottom. When you have all these communities claiming that, even though there's not a lot of evidence behind this, that if they don't have really strict anti-camping laws, anti-sleeping laws on the books, then people will migrate there from other places. And so they try to make theirs worse, and then other communities try to make theirs worse, and it just goes in a downward spiral. One, there's no evidence to show that people are actually mobile like that and going to places where there are fewer anti-homeless laws. Um, but two, when you have those kinds of standards in place, it actually takes the incentives away from a local government. As Dr. Green said at the beginning, we know these laws, criminalization policies, are actually more expensive and less effective. But the problem is that they are politically expedient. That when an individual goes to their elected official and says, "Look, there's a camp on my corner. It's scaring my clients. It's scaring my kids. I want it gone." It's much quicker for that elected official to pass a law that says it's illegal for somebody to be there, and then go send the police out, move the people off of that corner, even though it's doing nothing to solve the homelessness in the community. That person's just going to go somewhere. They're going to have an arrest record that's going to be a barrier to them getting housing. They're going to have fines and fees they have to pay before they can save up their first month's rent and security deposit. Um, but it'll satisfy that constituent, and they'll be able to say to that constituent, "Look, I solved your problem." Whereas if you want to go with a housing or shelter approach, you have to acknowledge the costs of it up front. You can't hide it in the police and jail budget. You have to find a site for your affordable housing development or your shelter, which nobody wants in their backyard, because of myths around who's going to be there. And then you've got, it's going to be 3 years later before you've even cited the thing, and you've been voted out of office because you weren't, quote unquote, responsive to your constituent. But if that elected official can say, look, I want to help you, I want to get that person off your corner, but the courts have told me, or this law tells me, I can't just criminalize that person unless there's somewhere else where that person can go, then it allows them to shift the conversation and say, so now let's have this, let's figure out where can that person go that's actually going to be better than the corner rather than just jail or the woods or somewhere that's worse. So these laws are actually, they're not a restriction on what communities can do, but it actually opens up the conversation to the constructive solutions, whereas right now they are effectively constrained by these kind of bad political incentives to just do whatever's most expeditious and hide the costs rather than do the right thing.
Thank you, Eric. And that, the political expediency mixed with the sort of legal confusion of all that uh, patchwork laws in place kind of contribute significantly to what we're seeing in a lot of the debate at a state level around this issue. And so I want to pivot now to Jasmine to ask at that sort of high state level, what problem is the forthcoming bill that the ACLU is working on in part with all of our partners as well? What problem is that bill trying to solve, and what is it not trying to do?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So I would say at a high level, the problem that this bill, which is House Bill 2489, the problem that it's trying to solve is really related to, as you've already heard, the chaos and the harm that is created by a patchwork of local ordinances that punish people for surviving outside. Right now in Washington, we have hundreds of different city and county laws regulating homelessness, each of them with different rules and different penalties and different enforcement practices. So that patchwork is not going to solve homelessness. All that it stands to do is push people from one jurisdiction to another, which is creating the constant displacement that everyone has been talking about, instability and deeper trauma for people who already lack safe alternatives. So I would say that the bill responds to that reality by creating one very clear statewide standard. Instead of leaving people's basic survival to chance, this bill ties enforcement to a very simple principle. You cannot punish someone for unavoidable life-sustaining activities when there is nowhere else to go. Shelter availability matters here. The same way that it mattered when Martin v. Boise was the law of the land. This was the law for 5, 6 years. We have done this before. The sky did not fall. I want that to be incredibly clear. But just as important is what this bill is not trying to do. So this is not a housing bill. It does not magically create shelter, nor does it create permanent housing overnight. It also doesn't dictate how local governments have to design their homelessness response. What it does do is harm reduction. So it's stopping the cycle of punishment without solutions. It brings clarity and consistency where confusion currently reigns, and it really sets a humane baseline while we continue the much larger and necessary work of building housing and robust services statewide.
Thank you, Jasmine. And talking about this sort of statewide standard that this bill would hope to establish, I want to open it up to all of the panelists now and invite input for the question of like, how would a statewide standard like this bill is trying to establish change things for people who are directly impacted and for other communities and for service providers and the work that all of you do?
Well, I know I can speak for the Lived Experience Coalition and probably for a lot of other coalitions across our state. To keep up as municipalities rapidly roll out criminalization measures targeting our unhoused neighbors has been impossible. it's like this chaotic patchwork. And so we see in communities across our state where survival is being made illegal. Uh, and this chaotic patchwork of laws that punish poverty and intentionally push people out of the very places they call home. And this constant wave of local attacks, it's unsustainable. It also allows some jurisdictions to displace their own community members and leaving our unhoused neighbors at varying and dangerous levels of risk simply for crossing a city line. And so a statewide homeless bill of rights declares once and for all, right, that across our entire state, that being unhoused does not mean being unhuman, that our unhoused neighbors' dignity, safety, and rights matter and must not disappear at city limits. And it also replaces the fear with a sense of protection and an affirmation that everyone, especially like I mentioned, with the enormous uh, wealth inequality, housing is tremendously unaffordable for many. Uh, as people are working towards permanent housing, they have a right to exist and they need to rest somewhere. And that should be dignified and that shouldn't be criminalization.
I would like to explain why it would be such a big deal in the area in which I live, because I am operating in Spokane. So in Spokane, as soon as Martin versus Boise was dismantled, a whole slew of criminalizing homeless laws came into play. It took 2 years for Jules Helping Hands to fight the city of Spokane to get a law called Proposition 1 off of the books, which criminalized anybody standing, sitting, laying within 1,000 yards of a school, a daycare, a homeless shelter, a treatment facility. So when we finally mapped that out, there was literally maybe 1 mile in our city that people experiencing homelessness could exist without it being criminalized. The bad thing about where we live is that law came off the books here in Spokane. 7 miles to the other side is Spokane Valley. And they are pushing for treatment first, not housing first. So if you are 7 miles on the other side of the city line, you have an entire different experience than people do in Spokane. If you go another 20 miles, you're running into the Idaho border. In Idaho, there's no homeless people. At least that's what they say. And there's lots of homeless people in Idaho. The unfortunate problem is those folks are then displaced to Spokane. So they've left the community in which they exist. They've been displaced from the state that they live in. They move down the path, go headed to Spokane because Spokane is the closest place that has services within a 75-mile radius. This city's it. The smaller cities that surround Spokane do not have shelters, but yet enforce homeless policy. So a statewide law that mandated this is the law of the land would significantly change the homeless experience in Spokane and hopefully make it more rare and brief.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of double down on my earlier point that what this does is it prevents that race to the bottom, and far from uh, putting limits on what communities can do and what elected officials can do in terms of how they address homelessness. It actually opens up the conversation to the constructive solutions that are actually going to work and helps them get out of their kind of political bind in order to be able to do that, and allows them in this case to say, look, like I said, look, I agree people should not be sleeping on the streets. We can all agree on that. But the solution is not to put them into jail. That's just gonna, jail is the most expensive form of housing. Costs hundreds of dollars a night to keep somebody in jail when they could be housed for a fraction of that cost. So let's focus on getting them into housing. That's going to solve the problem permanently rather than just putting somebody into an expensive jail and then putting them back out on the streets with an arrest record and fines and fees that are only going to make them have to stay on the streets longer. Criminalization, if you don't want uh, an encampment on your corner, criminalization is literally the worst way to approach it. It's going to make that encampment have to exist longer, perhaps not on that corner, but somewhere in the community. And so, yeah, this opens us up to the things that are going to actually help us be able to end homelessness.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything my fellow panelists have said. A single statewide standard would reduce displacement and uncertainty by ensuring that people are not punished for surviving simply because they crossed a city line, to Julie's point. And it gives service providers and communities a very clear, consistent framework to operate within. So instead of cycling people through enforcement and trauma, it would shift the focus towards stability and predictability and connection to vital services where shelter is actually available.
Thank you, all of you. And I want to keep this next question open to all of you as well, as individuals who work in and are very well acquainted with homelessness and the rhetoric around homelessness in the state. I'm sure you're all aware there are a lot of myths surrounding homelessness and public safety. And so, what is one common misconception you hear about homelessness or about criminalization of homelessness that you want to take the time to correct?
Well, I would just start by saying, and I have to give credit and honor to the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. I went to their Undoing Institutional Racism training numerous times, and it is so powerful and amazing. And Ron Chisholm, one of the founders of the People's Institute, he always says this saying, poor people, Black, Brown, Indigenous people, they don't need more programming, they need their power back. And so I just want everyone to remember the history. Who is actually overrepresented in homelessness? And we know it's Black people, it's brown people, it's Indigenous people. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander people have some of the highest levels of homelessness. It's people of all races living with disabilities. And yes, substance use disorder is a disability. Some disabilities we consider worthy and some unworthy, right? And so there's shame and stigma. Oh, you just need to stop doing this or stop doing that, right? That's ableism. But also lesbian, gay, trans youth, right? Two-spirit youth, low income and working class people. And so when we look at who is overrepresented in homelessness, we see that these are historically disenfranchised groups. These are groups that have been told that their lives matter less. Another myth is that, oh, this is too big of an issue and there's not enough funding. Even there's a myth that there's not enough housing. Look at how many empty apartments we have in some of our large cities. Look at how many abandoned buildings, government owned, are churches that could be adaptively reused. So that's also a bit of a myth that we don't have enough housing or enough places that we can modify to create safe and stable housing. And we know that in the United States, to ensure that every resident has housing is about the cost that we spend on Christmas decorations and Christmas lights each year. Way smaller than corporate tax breaks, way smaller than the perks and deductions that homeowners get, way smaller than all of that. And I remember a professor once told me that it's the social norms that hold these problems in place. And social norms are the invisible codes that regulate human behavior and hold social problems in place. So homelessness is solvable, right? But it's because we don't really value the people that are experiencing homelessness. And I also want to state that people are not homeless because they don't want housing. That's also, I hear this a lot. I talk to people and they want to be homeless. You know, the majority of people do not want to be experiencing being unhoused. They're homeless because housing is either unavailable, unaffordable, or inaccessible. And criminalization, uh, and what criminalization does is it pretends that punishment will somehow produce stability. And that is the most backwards thing I can think about. You know, a ticket isn't going to turn into a lease, a suite doesn't turn into a shelter, and a jail cell darn sure isn't going to turn into a home.
I would also like to break the myth of if we build it, they will come. I hear that on a regular basis. There is no secret system of people experiencing homelessness that says, oh, in Spokane, we have bathrooms, so we should go there. These things are not happening. Are there people that are coming to our cities from other places? Yes. I am not a resident. I am a resident of Spokane, but I was not born and raised here. This is my home. Because I purchased a home here, I'm considered a citizen. That doesn't make sense to me. And we talk about if we do these things for people, other people will benefit. Absolutely. If you put up a public restroom downtown, I'm going to be able to go to the bathroom or take my mom to go to the bathroom when I go walk downtown. If you set up bus stations with benches, because a homeless person sleeps there at night does not mean that I can't go get on the bus as well. I just move aside and let our homeless neighbor also sit on the bench with me. That's what I do. That's not what this city does. And that is not the complaint from most of the business owners in our city. It is, we cannot put bathrooms out here because people will use them. We cannot build shelters because other cities are going to have people come here. I can tell you from being on the front lines, and I've lived and worked this homelessness issue for 7 years straight. I live, work, and participate with these folks every day, and that myth is absolutely not true.
I sort of playing off of what Dr. Green said, say that the biggest myth is that homelessness is a choice. Um, you know, nobody starts off their life saying, you know what I want to do when I grow up is I want to be homeless. Um, if there are people out there who are saying they are there by choice, it's not actively a choice. It's because of a lack of other choices. If we had enough affordable housing and enough supports for people who need the supports to live in communities, nobody would choose to be outside. Nobody, it's really hard to live outside. It's not dignified, it's not uh, easy, it's not healthy, and nobody is making that choice in the absence of the much more important choices that we've made collectively as a society to say that we're not going to make sure that all of our community members have access to affordable, safe housing. Um, the problem with this myth that homelessness is a choice, um, it's based in uh, some of our kind of most deeply held myths that we hold about America. That this is a country where there's this American work ethic, and if you work hard, then you get ahead. And the corollary of that is if you haven't gotten ahead, then it must be because you as an individual haven't worked hard. This American work ethic has been used to justify racism and ableism for centuries. It's never been true. There are many people who worked really hard and couldn't get ahead because of systemic barriers against them. And right now we have systemic barriers, including that most people who are working a minimum wage job can't afford the rent. Um, that's not because of their own choices. It's not because they aren't working hard. It's again because of these collective choices we've made as a society not to prioritize the construction of enough affordable housing and to instead allow developers to create luxury condos for investment, but not to be used for basic human needs. And so yeah, all of these myths and misconceptions uh, then lead to this place where if homelessness is a choice, then we can do things to deter people from homelessness, like punishing them. But you can't deter somebody from needing to sleep. And when there's literally nowhere else where people can do that, then they have to do it outside. So even on its own face, this idea of a deterrence, a push to getting out of homelessness, it fails. Um, but because we have all these myths, that kind of all gets swept under the rug.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think one of the most common misconceptions is that criminalization is the more cost-effective or realistic response to homelessness, when in reality, we are already spending the money needed. We are just doing so in the least effective way possible. So, on average, it costs Washington taxpayers a little over $70,000 per year to incarcerate one person, compared to roughly $19,000 a year to provide them with permanent supportive housing, which would actually provide stability and reduce reliance on emergency systems. So when we are choosing enforcement over and over again, we are repeatedly paying for police responses, jail stays, court involvement, emergency care, without moving anyone closer to housing or safety. Those dollars could instead be invested in solutions that work, that reduce harm, and that ultimately make communities healthier in the long run. So this misconception is that punishment somehow saves resources when in fact it is costing far more and delivering worse outcomes.
Thank you to all of you for your input and your insight on these sort of misconceptions. I want to ask Jasmine or Eric or both, whichever works for the two of you. Can you talk a bit about how criminalization policies intersect with racial inequity and disability and why that matters when we're talking about public policy?
I'll kick it off. Uh, I mean, uh, in the US, because of historical racial discrimination in housing and in employment, and in the criminal justice system, um, more people of color or are experiencing homelessness to begin with. Disproportionate amounts of people are experiencing homelessness, and therefore they are more exposed out on the streets to surveillance by the police and behaviors that are perfectly legal for you and I to do in our home. Right now, I'm sitting in my home, I'm resting, I'm sheltering myself. Those are all perfectly legal for me to do. But if I'm out on the streets, none of those things are legal for me to do. And then when you layer that with the um, racism that's baked into the uh, law enforcement system, those people are even more likely to be targeted by law enforcement. And so there have been surveys done in San Francisco and elsewhere that show that people of color experiencing homelessness are 10 times more likely, or sorry, black people experiencing homelessness are 10 times more likely than white people experiencing homelessness to receive citations. Latinx people are 6 times more likely to receive citations than white people experiencing homelessness. So everybody of all races, white people included, are impacted um, by criminalization, but traditionally marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, disabled communities, transgender, LGBTQ folks, are all disproportionately even further impacted. So the most marginalized are hurt first and hurt worst.
Yeah, I would add that criminalization policies don't impact everyone equally, to Eric's point. They disproportionately harm Black and Indigenous and other people of color, as well as people with disabilities, especially those with mental health conditions or substance use disorders, or even physical disabilities that make shelter inaccessible or unsafe. And because of to Eric's point, because of long-standing racial inequities in housing and healthcare in the criminal legal system, these communities are already overrepresented among people experiencing homelessness, and they are more likely to be stopped, to be cited, or even arrested under survival-based ordinances. And that really matters for public policy because laws that might appear neutral on their face can really deepen structural inequities in practice. So when we are relying on enforcement instead of housing and services, we are effectively using the criminal legal system to manage racial and disability inequities rather than addressing their root causes. So good public policy should always reduce harm and close equity gaps, not widen them. And that requires setting standards that prevent discriminatory impacts while also investing in solutions that actually promote safety and dignity and stability for everyone.
And if I can just add one more point, uh, there is, studies have shown that in some communities, more than half of the people in jail on any given night are there because they're homeless and through these policies promoting criminalization. And so even if, your interests are more on the racial justice front or more on the disability justice front, criminalization of homelessness is your issue because this is the entry point where so many Black people, Indigenous folks, other people of color, disabled folks, LGBTQ folks have their entry point into the criminal justice system and then are subject to all of the collateral consequences of getting wrapped up into it. And so, and I think this is important for us to understand as advocates, because as a homelessness rights advocate, like, I love how amazing our advocates are, but we don't have the power to pass a law like this on our own. But if the folks who are working on racial justice issues, who are working on disability justice issues, this is a workers' rights issue. This is, all of these folks understand that criminalization of homelessness harms the folks that they care about, too. That's how we build the power to get a law like this passed. And so, yeah, I just wanted to emphasize this is that entry point where so many of our vulnerable community members get pulled into the system. And if we can stop this, then it's going to make things better in so many other ways. There's going to be so many kind of positive ripple effects that can come out of this.
Thank you, Jasmine and Eric, for that, and a beautiful segue as well. As we get toward the tail end of our discussion, we've spent a lot of time talking about what better policy should and should not look like, and what the policies in place do and don't do in regard to helping our communities. And so I especially want to ask Julie and Dr. Green, for community members who want to support solutions instead of punishment, what should they be paying attention to or pushing for locally?
Yes. And so I appreciated someone in the chat was saying that we're kind of preaching to the choir here. But I just want to remind everyone that, poor and working class people, there's way more of us than them, right? And I'm not trying to do an us versus them because there are a lot of kind, upper middle income and wealthy people, but we got to awaken the sleeping giant. poor and working class people. And as community organizers, we have to become better communicators. And so I'm going to talk to my white cousins here for a moment. I love y'all, but sometimes y'all can be harsh on your white brothers and sisters and gender non-binary folks, right? And so we need to become better communicators so we could build bridges to help people see the commonality, because a lot of poor white folks are impacted by this, right? So if we can unify and not let identity and play into the divide and conquer strategy, right? That's set up with some of the identity politics, so that we're all like fighting each other and we can't come together powerfully. And so I also want to say too that if we aren't organizing and engaged in some manner, and I say this with politeness, but if we're doing nothing, then we're maintaining the status quo. And I know a lot of us are busy. I know many of us on this call are doing work, but maybe this is your first time on a call like this. Find a coalition in your community. Support the ACLU and others in this work to get a homeless Bill of Rights, right? Because that's what it's going to take. And so if you want to support solutions instead of punishment, we also need to stop asking what unhoused people are doing wrong and start asking what your city is doing with its power and money. What is your city doing with its power and money, honey? And so from a lived experience perspective, we would like communities to push for locally some of the things. First, follow the budget. Show up at those city and county council meetings, right? Pay attention to where your city is, what your city is funding and shelter and housing and outreach. Or are they pouring money into police sweeps and enforcement, right? Because budget will tell you the truth, even when speeches don't. And the devil is in the detail. So pay attention to your jurisdiction, how much money they're pouring into sweeps. Ask those questions and join with others and bring them to those public comments. Second, demand housing before handcuffs. Push for policies that prioritize shelter and housing placement before any enforcement action. If there's no safe place to go, punishment is violence, right? And when we say safe, a dignified safe place where you can bring your partner, your pets, and your possessions. And we have to organize with the people and not for the people, right? Saviorism gotta go. We say this at the LEC. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solutions, but furthest from power and resources. So being principled and accountable relationships with our unhoused neighbors, like the ACLU is modeling in all of this work. And so support and fund groups led by people with lived experience. Show up at council meetings. Let us speak, pass the mic, and back it up with resources. And watch how community safety is defined. Again, sometimes our elected officials are super tricky, right? They'll write a beautiful document like the Compassion Seattle, and it'll have a little drop of poison in it, right? So if safety only means fewer tents, but more people dying, that is not safety. And more people are dying in our communities, right? And they're even manipulating, and some of the public health departments, how they report the death reporting is even shifting in some communities. So real safety is stability, health, and dignity. And finally, please stay engaged. Take care of yourself, and we have to be in this fight for the long time, because criminalization thrives on silence between sweeps, and justice is built by people who keep showing up, keep organizing, and refuse to accept punishment as policy. And I just want to give a shout out to Survive to Thrive, this group of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander men who have not only experienced homelessness and housing insecurity, but also due to the racism, a lot of services are not meant for them. And there's been studies linking how that then amplifies crimes of survival. We have young men that are being turned down for job after job after job, right? And so please, let's advocate and push for this. I'm sorry I took so much space.
Education of your community. That is the most important thing, and that needs to be spread is the real truths. Conversations like this that have real information, because the media, the business owners, the politicians, they tell a narrative. We need to be telling facts. We need to be explaining whys of what is going on, how it's going to affect you, how it's going to affect your neighbors, and what the long-term effects of all of these policies are. We talk about what immediately makes things better because you criminalize our friends experiencing homelessness by saying you can't be here. Okay, so let's just accept that that's what it is. But then what happens because of that? So that person isn't going to go away because we cover our eyes and pretend we can't see them. They need the systems to work for them, and we need to educate our community on how to do those things. And if your law is detrimental to people experiencing homelessness, never, ever, ever believe that one person standing up can't rally an entire community, because I'm proof that that can happen.
Thank you so much, Julie and Dr. Green. And Jasmine, to sort of take us home, as this bill makes its way through the legislative session, can you talk about what meaningful public engagement looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to say it better than Dr. Green and Julie, but I can certainly try. I would say that meaningful public engagement right now means staying involved beyond the first hearing and really helping lawmakers understand what life actually looks like for people experiencing homelessness in their districts. That can include sharing personal experiences or listening to people who are directly impacted and having honest conversations with your friends, with your neighbors, with your community members about why punishment does not solve homelessness. It also means paying attention as the bill moves through the legislature, following our updates, showing support for the bill's core values, and also speaking up when harmful narratives resurface, because they will. Public engagement really matters because lawmakers respond to what they hear from their constituents, and sustained involvement helps keep the focus on dignity and fairness and solutions that reduce harm rather than deepen it.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And with that, with fantastic timing, we will be wrapping up the webinar this evening. I want to thank Dr. Lamont Green of the Lived Experience Coalition, Julie Garcia of Jules Helping Hands, Eric Tars of the National Homelessness Law Center, and of course, Jasmine Clark, our Smart Justice Policy Director at the ACLU of Washington. Uh, this entire webinar was Choose Shelter, Not Penalties, about ending the criminalization of homelessness in Washington. We're very grateful for all of you who have attended and who have taken on a lot of this information, and especially on a weekday evening when I know that sometimes talking about homelessness policy maybe isn't what you think is a fun, exciting time, but it is a very important time and a very important topic. For those who want to stay engaged, you can, of course, keep up with all of the organizations and individuals who are part of this panel. You can also keep up with the ACLU of Washington's work as we push this bill through the legislative process and advocate for it, uh, either via our website or our action alerts, which are also on our website. Yeah, thank you all so much. And of course, please advocate both on a state level and in your communities, because real public safety does start with shelter and stability and dignity and not punishment in any capacity.